Why do I write about bad science? And why am I talking to you about this in a toilet, in a disabled toilet in Conway Hall? Well, I don't care about people getting ripped off. I'm perfectly happy to see that as a kind of voluntary self-administered tax on scientific ignorance. And I don't care about... I don't even think that sort of quackery or anything is really bad for the NHS. I think, you know, there are so many much more important sources of wastage. And I don't particularly worry that people are lied to by journalists on individual issues. What I worry about, the reason why I write bad science, is the notion that quacks and the media are sort of conspiring to promote the public's misunderstanding of evidence, to actively undermine people's understanding of what it means for there to be evidence that something is either good for you or bad for you. And I think that's particularly vicious at this particular point in history, because, you know, 30 or 40 years ago when you went to medical school, your communication skills training, such as it was, consisted of being told how not to tell somebody that they were dying of cancer. Whereas now, in medical school, you're taught, and this is a direct quote from our communication skills handout, how to work collaboratively with the patient towards an optimum health outcome. You know, if you go and see your doctor with a serious medical problem, they will talk through the pros and cons of different treatments. Not if you go and see them about antibiotics for your cold or anything, but if you go and see a doctor about treatments for cancer, they will, in all likelihood, talk you through the relative risks and benefits of different forms of chemotherapy, radiotherapy, different forms of surgery, and how we know whether one thing is better than another. And I think it's particularly vicious at this particular point in human history, in medical history, in the history of how doctors relate to patients, that when doctors are trying to do that, quacks in the media, these two incredibly powerful forces, have united to actively undermine patients' ability to make decisions for themselves by actively misrepresenting the whole process of evidence. I think that's a real tragedy. And that's the sort of sciencey bit, that's the medical bit rather. And the sciencey thing is, it's just annoying that people fill newspapers with lies and made up stuff. I mean, it's just irritating. And also it's funny. I mean, if there was kind of a manifesto, I suppose, scientists and academics take the piss out of each other's ideas. I mean, that's what they do, you know. I mean, that's what Karl Popper said, you know, it's disproving hypothesis is what he said. But, you know, scientists criticise each other's ideas. And I think by criticising the evidence base for assertions that other people are making, in a sense, you're narrativising the whole process of what it means to be a scientist, or what it means to take a sort of academic, scientific, evidence-based approach to things. But also, it's a really good opportunity to explain really simple things, because it's a hook, you know, in some respects it's a gimmick. You know, if you wanted to write a mini essay on how you correct for multiple comparisons using Bonferroni correction, a little stats lecture in a national newspaper on the news pages on a Saturday, you wouldn't get away with it in a million years. But you can hook that onto, this is why the Times' front page story about how twice as many kids are using cocaine as 1 year ago is wrong. And then you've got a kind of excuse to explain really basic concepts in stats and science that should, to my mind, be taught at school, you know. You can't. I mean, there is literally nothing you can do. You can't stop people from writing stupid things. What you can do is add to the madness. So, you know, I mean, I got Conway the Guardian by ringing up. If you look on the letters page of any newspaper, this is careers counselling, then they have the address and the telephone number. And you just ring out the telephone number, and then somebody picks up the phone, and you ask for the person you want, you know, features desk, health editor, science editor, and then they put you through, and then you can say, I'd like to write this for you, and then sometimes they let you. They might ask you if you've written anything before, just lie. Or, you know, have a good blog, or, you know, have things that you've written before in magazines, like student magazines or whatever, and add to the madness. And actually, I think scientists are in a really strong position on that, because journalists are such idiots that they're really, I mean, they're hugely impressed by qualifications. I mean, I never sort of pushed mine, but if you, you know, if you're like a prof or a doctor and you ring up a newspaper and say, you know, I want to write about this, you know, they'll be falling over themselves in a lot of cases, and I think that's how you do it. I think it's meaningless to expect that there could be some kind of administrative or regulatory response to bad ideas in mainstream media, because apart from anything else, the costs of doing that, these sort of adverse side effects, would be horrendous, really. But what you can do is add your own sense into the madness. And the other great thing is, you know, blogs. Just resting on a soap dispenser. Would you like to see where we are? We're actually hanging out in the loo. Blogs. There's something really interesting, I think, about the rise of blogs. About 10 years ago, I was convinced that we were going to hell in a handcart, to quote the Daily Mail, because nerds are really important, both sort of socially and culturally, but also economically to a country. And with the death of sort of TV science, you know, Horizon going to nonsense, and the fact that there is no sort of stimulating sciencey content in mainstream media, the fact that it's all massively dumbed down, it felt to me as if we were kind of neglecting this whole sort of corner of our culture. Flaky humanities graduates who run the media have this sort of fantastical notion, quite sort of dichotomous view of the world in which there are scientists and non-scientists. But in reality, what there really are out there, in their millions, are people who did biochemistry at Leicester and now work in senior management at Marks and Spencer's. And there's nothing to stimulate them in mainstream culture. There's nothing that parallels, you know, if you open the Guardian book review section, you get a 5-page long essay on some Russian novelist I've never heard of, you know, and you get that kind of thing in mainstream popular culture, but there was no scientific equivalent of that. But the miracle of the internet, the greatest reproducing machine ever invented, is that now people can just sort of set up and run their own blogs and talk about stuff in a really interesting, stimulating way. You can engage with them, you can choose your own level of how difficult you want it to be, and also it's very transparent. I mean, blogs have a kind of two-pronged attack on mainstream media misrepresentations of science, because on the one hand, I genuinely think they do it better, and then at the same time, they're all running around pointing out how mainstream media gets things wrong. And people say, well, how do you know who to rely on? And actually, I think blogs are potentially more reliable than mainstream media ever was, mainly because you can check for each individual blog author how credible they are, because bloggers link to primary resources. So, you know, in a newspaper you might say, well, either it's in print or it's not, and so I think it's true or not, or it's like got this percentage chance of being true. With a blog, I can go, all right, well, he's talking about this scientific paper. He's linked to it, so I can go and read the paper and see if he has given an accurate précis of what they did and what they found. He's got comments, so if there were any really massively obvious holes in his argument, apart from just sort of tedious, sort of childish arguments, you know, if there's a serious criticism to be made, then in all likelihood I'll see it written there. But also, if he's responding to somebody else's ideas, a blogger will link a blogger will link to that other person's argument, and then you can see for yourself if they've fairly represented it or if they've given you a straw man misrepresentation. And so you very rapidly develop a sense of whether somebody is an idiot or not. And actually in print it was impossible to do that. I mean, journalists even now, I find it fascinating, go out of their way to hide the mechanics of how they do their job from the general public. You know, in reality, most of the quotes that you see in a newspaper article, they're taken from a press release. But they write it as if they spoke to the person. In reality, the individual people that journalists have in their stories for their, you know, here's the sort of, you know, one woman's struggle against X. In reality, they've been sourced from somewhere like Response Source, which is kind of like a dating service, a matching system. Journalists go onto this thing, Response Source, it's like the sort of secret, hidden story behind the rubbishness of the news. Journalists go on and say, oh, I'm looking for, you know, a fat person who lost a lot of weight and then put it all on again or something. Can you find that for me? And then all these PRs who subscribe to that one channel will then run around and they'll sort of go around and they'll try and find a person who fits the journalist's requirement for a story, and then they'll sort of give it to them and place the product in it. And you know, journalists are so desperate to sort of hide the process of what they do, whereas in blogs it's all entirely transparent. I mean, whenever people respond to you in newspapers, hell, I mean, I'm glad of people responding to what I say, but whenever it's happening in newspapers, there was something by Mel P once, like Melanie Phillips, and you know, people sort of respond to something that's like one sentence and ignore the entire swathe of what you said, and you can get away with that in newsprint because it was 3 days ago, the thing that you're writing about, and nobody's going to go back and go, oh, what did you... Whereas in blogs you can link to it immediately and see whether it's a straw man big enough to burn Edward Woodward or if it's proper.